visitors. So we are here having a last day of our exhibition called Time, Space, Existence, which we opened with so many challenges after this 2020 and 2021, but it was a great communal effort. Part of this success is also the participation of Pedro in architectural democracy in this exhibition, which is hosted, his presentation is hosted in this venue at the first floor. So I would invite you afterwards to visit it. Time, Space, Existence is a project which I started already in 2014. It's a project that we do every 2 years in coordination with the Venice Biennale, the architecture edition. And we aim to bring together a various group of researchers, creative thinkers, architects, photographer of architecture, but also university and research project. Among our research, we found also the project of Pedro, which we got to know through another project of his, which is gamified co-housing, which we have presented in the exhibition that we hosted at the Sushev Museum in Moscow. Now today we have a debate, a very interesting debate, where we have different figures also tackling down the topic of architecture and democracy. So, just to brief it a little bit, we will discuss democracy and architecture with the panelists John Keane and Saskia Sassen and Pedro Aibéo. Following architectural democracy, Decision City, presented here in Venice in collaboration with Mezza Wood and Accenture Interactive. We are closing this exhibition with this debate. Pedro Aibéo from Architectural Democracy is a Portuguese architect and civil engineer, and among others is also a visiting associate professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a PhD at Aalto University, specifically on architectural democracy, which is a title and a project that he started himself and that he's going to tell us more about today. Architectural democracy started as an academic research in Finland already 10 years ago. The term, as I was saying, was just invented, coined by Pedro, proposing a framework of the relationship between architecture and democracy for all stakeholders to better understand the complexity of cities and those to participate more actively in the planning decision that affects their life. Is the sound still okay? Okay. So with the project Architecture Democracy, Pedro and the group he's working with encourage active participation in the decision-making process for urban planning, stating that the kind of people we want to be is the kind of city we should be designing for. So it's a very active-based thinking in the way we make architecture. So it's a very democratical in that sense, trying to get the responses to shape what we want as for a city and our environment. So Pedro, I don't know if you want to add something to it, or perhaps you want to already move on and eventually present also John and Saskia?
Yes. Mille grazie, Valeria, for the presentation. Very kind.
Pleasure.
We have short time, and first of all, just to notify, we had a slight problem with our second invited person, Saskia Sassen. So we made a pre-record of her, and we have live today John Keane. So it was meant to be a debate. We'll try to make it still a debate, like a bit of again, an hybrid, online, physical, pre-recorded and live. Saskia Sassen and John Keane need almost no introduction, but of course I will introduce them. Saskia is a Dutch-American sociologist, noted for her analysis of globalization and international human migration. She is a Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University and Centennial Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics. Sassen coined the term global city. John Keane is born in Southern Australia. He's live with us all the way from Sydney, which is now quite late. He is a professor of politics at University of Sydney and at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. He is the co-founder and director of the Sydney Democracy Network. Renowned globally for his creative thinking about democracy, John Keane was educated at universities of Adelaide and Toronto, where he was mentored by C.B. Macpherson and King's College, University of Cambridge. John, welcome. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well, Pedro. Obrigado. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you. It is almost Monday here in Sydney.
Thank you for doing this. Let's try to jump straight in the topic as the time is short and you have to get ready for your Monday work. The reason I wanted to get you guys together is because you are, in my opinion, one of the leading experts about the history of democracy, and Saskia is one of the leading experts on cities, on the globalization of cities. So almost a perfect match for architecture and democracy link. To make this debate a bit possible, we'll try to frame it with 5 questions, and I'll try to just play what I pre-recorded with Saskia. Before that, just to make it clear, what we want to start here is that with the increased complexity of cities, but with our stagnant or maybe completely still development of cognitive abilities as human beings, how are we going to cope with that mismatch between cities getting more complex by the day and we not being able to develop ourselves even biologically? Of course, there are other ways. Are we going to be replaced by an automated democracy? And democracy that is, for example, with the control of the traffic lights, everything is then decided by some kind of algorithm. So I pose this question to Saskia. I'll try to play it, and then we'll discuss it with John. Mm-hmm. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
I think that's a great question. And as you probably know, I do a lot of interviews, and I rarely hear this type of question that you ask, you know, that's something we need to take seriously. Some of the transformations we are seeing, they may lead us to a very different set of options, but also constraints. And, you know, we tend to think if something really works well, like a city where we live in, that, okay, so that's going to last. Not necessarily. And you can just look at the whole, you know, list of destroyed cities, not just because of wars, but because of all kinds of other things, you know, the rise of certain actors, et cetera, et cetera. So now the big question is, across the ages, cities have existed. I mean, they go back way, way, way back. And they have survived. Some have been profoundly destroyed, but then they re-emerged in some way. So one thing one can say about a city, say, unlike a regime, a power regime, is that cities have very long lives. They may suffer massive destructions, but by God, they recover in a way that a king, etc., might not.
John, can you hear me?
Yes.
Did you listen? Did it work? Did you listen to Saskia's video?
Yes, I heard it clearly, but
okay.
Only the...
Okay. Just making sure. John, how do you feel that? How do you feel? I mean, Saskia clearly made the point that no matter what regimes the cities have built up, they have overlived those. Would you see that are we going to, cities are almost independent of the power regime?
Short answer, they are never independent of the broader power regime in which they are born, in which they exist and survive through time. And I'm sure that Saskia would be the first to say that, you know, depending upon a monarchy or a despotism or an empire, imperial setting, cities are shaped by those broader forces. But the durability of cities is, it strikes me that that's a very important point. Time runs through cities, yes, but their durability is striking. And I like to think of, in the matter of cities and democracy, in terms of the German historian Reinhard Koselleck spoke about sediments of time. That is, the way in which cities developed certain customs, institutions, rules, and those rules and those customs, those institutions survive through time. Example, if we think in the European tradition of the language of civil society, società civile, and the family of terms that are very important for the way we think about democracy today: civility, citizen of a town. I mean, this language of citizenship, of civil society, was born at a much earlier point. It is a product of urban life. And not only that, but cities in late medieval and early modern Europe were small in number. In 1500, maybe only 3 or 4 cities that had a population of 100,000 residents or more. Naples was the largest in that year. And yet, those cities contributed a great deal to the whole subject of democracy and the way we think about power. The right to resist tyranny, the call to abolish monarchy, constitutional conventions, popular elections, the right of toleration of religious differences, liberty of the press. I mean, and later, inventions like municipal socialism. I mean, all of these were creations of urban settings, of citizens and their representatives in a broader power context. And those customs, the whole spirit of those innovations survive until today. They're a very important part of urban history. So yes, cities have long lives, and yes, they outlived kings. Saskia is right about this.
But that's great. But would you think that the scale in this, the examples you gave those cities were more of a human scale. They were more graspable. Now we are seeing the rise of the mega cities. Do you think that has changed that perception? Are cities still connected with their power regimes in such a way that it was before, or is it losing that continuity?
This is a very good question, and a very tough question, almost impossible to answer. I'm a bit old-fashioned on this question, Pedro, because I go back in time to a Berliner. His name was Georg Simmel. And Simmel was one of the great and very first analysts of modern urban life. And when you read Simmel, where his writing is inspired by living in Berlin, that was becoming one of the great European cities, one of the great global cities. You see that in Simmel's writings on urban life, on the impact of the metropolis, you see his emphasis on restlessness of life and institutions inside cities. You see his emphasis on conflict. Cities are never, zones of harmony, as, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright was more or less at the same time trying to say. He emphasized that cities were zones of commerce and exchange, of commodity production and exchange. They were capitalist. They were also structured by government institutions. There was a plurality of architecture in Berlin. Simmel noted, Schinkel's neoclassicism. He noticed the Nouveau, Art Nouveau styles. He was impressed by Unter den Linden, this wonderful boulevard that runs through Berlin. So the point I'm making is that Simmel, at a very early stage, was aware of this, the way that urban life adds to the, deepens the sense of complexity of the world in which subjects live. He didn't quite say, but his colleague Max Weber said, that there were only two civilizations that developed complex cities with winding streets that resembled a kind of puzzle, a maze. One was Islam and the other was Christian Europe. Now, however contested that view is, however Orientalist it might be, the point that I'm making is that there were earlier writers who were impressed by complexity of cities, of the hyper-complexity of cities. The question is, what is different about the cities today? Well, the scale is very clearly different. If we look at the Chinese plans for a greater Bay Area city to include Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, this is to be the largest megacity in the history of the human species. And as researchers, as architects, no doubt there's a lot of work to be done to make sense of how that megacity is going to operate. So I'm more relaxed about the complexity problem. I think it's a problem. It's a challenge that was noted 100 years ago, and it continues to be with us. The warning, the implication here, Pedro, I think is that there is a warning, which is that whatever we say about cities in the present and in the past are always interpretations. They're selective accounts of vast totalities that are in a way ungraspable. And it's one of the magic of cities. It's one of the attractiveness of cities. It was historically, and it remains so today. When you arrive in a city which is unknown to you, I'm not romanticizing things, one is struck by the contrast between rich and poor, between decadence and innovation. One is struck by the blight of concrete, and one is struck by the rewilding projects that go on. And it's so to say, it puts one's head in a whirl, in a kind of, it makes for a certain dizziness. And that should be borne in mind when we talk about the subject. Modesty.
Wonderful. John, I'll jump into the next topic, put Saskia's answer to the following question. Charles Montgomery's Happy City work or Jan Gell's work clearly show the impact of the design of cities that can create more empathic and empathetic people. Researchers and activists do an awesome work, but it almost never reaches city planners to implement it. How can we bridge this? And Saskia wondered a bit around this topic. Let me try to share again screen.
Right. Well, let me start with a little the marking of a difference. So there are certain cities, especially in the north of Europe, that have functioned very, very well across much time. They're not rich, but they are fine. You know, they have everything they need. They are not poor either. And And they have, with a considerable ease, respected each other. You know, there were also differences of culture and of politics, doesn't matter. The city was the project, and they worked that out together. Now, you have certain cities. I mean, most cities are like that. You know, they function, they are smallish. Most people in the world don't know that they exist, so they're never invaded, let's say, you know, by masses of foreigners who want to visit. It is the large cities, the really big and well-known cities, that are more the problem. Now, they contain within them very important contributions to to a system, to a situation, to a kingdom, to whatever it might be. But at the same time, you know, they generate complexities, and not all complexities can work in those cities. So you know, we have these two moments, I would say, and I think that we're going to be stuck with that for quite a while. You know, this is not, we can generate where everything more or less works, everything is more or less the same. That is not how it works, because we have poor and we have rich, and we have bandits and we have honest. That is part of the city. The city is that institution that can handle all of that. Say, unlike, you know, a university or a grant, whatever, you know, operation somewhere in architecture. No, the city is really, it's a domain, it's an open domain with multiple options, multiple positives, multiple negatives, etc., etc. And it never completely stands still. When it stands still, it means it's a dead city.
John, clearly a demarcation between the small and the big city, as that Saskia did in regards to this topic. How can we implement changes from the bottom up? What's your take on this?
Well, a couple of remarks about Saskia's comments. I mean, I wish that universities were actually unlike, you know, mega cities. I wish universities were open, harmonious spaces of equality. That's severely under pressure. That image is severely under pressure in our times, in all parts of our planet. I think that, secondly, I think that Saskia's remarks about the multiple positives and the negatives is very important. Put a bit abstractly, the pluralism of cities, particularly of large cities, of mega cities, the pluralism tends to be self-paralyzing. And the symptoms are, you know, despoliation of environment because of excessive traffic, the malfunctioning of public transport, the violence, the criminality that is part of a culture of ressentiment, you know, that parts of the city feel left out. The problem of racism, and the list goes on, and they're familiar dysfunctions. I thirdly think that there is a danger of romanticizing small cities. I mean, there are small cities where nobody visits or very few people visit as tourists, where there is a sense of communitarianism, let's say. But I mean, I have visited in my life many small towns and cities that are not happy places. So I think that if size is a key variable for explaining why cities are happy or happier, I am not sure about this. But I want to say just one last thing, and forgive me, Pedro, because it is in a way a questioning of the architecture of democracy project. I mean, that phrase is actually the phrase of, I checked, Frank Lloyd Wright, and I do have actually a first edition of a book which is called When Democracy Builds, and published in 1945 on wonderfully aging paper, in which Frank Lloyd Wright presents a picture of an ideal city, perhaps a little bit like Saskia's small city, where there is harmony, there is, as he puts it, organic architecture, and even says at one point in this book that, you know, America is the place where the true democratic architecture is being built. And why is that the case? Because it's natural. He says that democracy is natural. Cities are natural expressions of democracy, and those cities are democratic because they are organic. You know, they are harmonious wholes. I mean, he was a kind of communitarian, I would say a green aristocrat. You know, he was well ahead of his time in that he thought in terms of the embedding of cities within the biomes on which they depend. And that was a far-reaching thought. But the image of a city as a place of communitarian equality, aristocracy, he called it, you know, where each individual flourishes like an aristocrat in dignity. I mean, I think this is an impossible idealization. I think it's a misdescription of cities, so that we are back to the question of Saskia's central and very important question of the self-paralyzing trends of large cities, the way in which pluralism cripples itself. And the question therefore becomes, how democratically can that city be regulated? How can it be governed? This is, I think, the central question. And cities that are unhappy, cities that are full of negatives, are cities which are badly governed or badly self-governed.
That's great. So, would you have would you have any examples in both mega cities and small cities of things that went well in that regards, of the activism bridging into the city planners? Would you be aware of some?
Well, here, yes, long discussion, and we don't have enough time, unfortunately, to talk globally about this topic because it's almost Monday for me. But this raises the question of malgovernment. I mean, poor, incompetent government, broadly speaking, of cities, abuses of power in cities that destroy solidarities, that destroy dignities of at least some of their population. So I think that democracy, we need to talk about what it means, but democracy is a central ingredient of a well-governed city, of a well-functioning and happy city. And in this respect, one other thing to say at the outset is that cities have been democratic laboratories. That was true for the ancient cities of Syria, Mesopotamia, Nippur, for example, or Babylon, where assemblies were invented. I tried to show in my work on the history of democracy that assemblies, assemblies of citizens who consider themselves as equals, who discuss and decide who gets what, when, and how, is not a Western, it's not a Greek invention. It actually, the archaeologists tell us, happened much earlier. So cities have a history of being democratic laboratories. In our time, I would say that the question, to complement what Saskia has said, the question is, is it still the case that cities are innovators? Are they, in matters of power and in matters of good government, are they spaces of innovation? And the short answer is, I think, yes. Despite the commercialization, the surveillance that plagues cities, the destruction of zones of solidarity, the biospheric degradations. Despite that, the picture is mixed because there are things going on in our times, such as, police monitoring groups, sanctuary cities, citizens' innovations to protect mosques, synagogues, churches, to protect the right to be different in matters of, let's say, queer politics. Cities are spaces where the greening of democracy has been going on for a generation. And without going on about this, I hope we can talk about how cities have actually contributed something to the whole idea and practice of democracy that never happened before, which is the extension of the rights of representation to our bylaws. So democracy comes to mean not just the self-government of people who can decide on earth whatever they want, but democracy is coming to mean, slowly but surely, the self-government of people, the refusal of arbitrary power, that acknowledges humans' dependence upon the non-human. This is a very fundamental innovation that largely happened in cities. And so we witness innovations such as the Opal Project in London, that citizens are called upon to note the birds and living beings in their back gardens, to try to monitor publicly species survival or destruction. Butterfly bridges are a small but very powerful simile of this trend. Butterflies and other insects don't like traffic. They don't like urbanization. It's destructive of their mating patterns, of their feeding patterns. But good citizens build bridges of flowers, across roads to enable butterflies to survive and to thrive in urban settings. And in general, the greening of cities is a very striking, and I would say of great historical importance. It's one of the striking examples of the way cities today continue to function as democratic laboratories.
Yes, for example, so participatory budgets that are increasingly being added into the cities.
Yes.
Flaws, but it's a first good step. I'll jump into the other topic because it's a good segue. What Saskia talked about the well, exactly the link between the rise of democracies or the rise of the new despotisms, which is actually linked with your latest book, and the cities, the connection with that.
Mm-hmm.
Look, a city exists under certain conditions, and that is considerable variety of power, of who wins, who loses, but at the same time that everybody is in principle enabled, not enabled at the same level, but enabled. That means that you have the rich and you have the poor, and they both benefit in many ways from a city. Do the rich benefit more? Of course they do. Mostly, probably, yes. But the poor, they are concerned about their condition. They are not playing chess, with the rich. They want to survive, basic survival. And when you're into basic survival, it's okay. If you have the basics that you need, it's okay. You don't have envy of the rich. You're too busy surviving. And that, in a way, for poor people, that rescues them out of a kind of bitterness and saying, why can I not be as rich as, they're too busy surviving. And that, again, I repeat, it's like almost like Mother Nature helped us here, so that we focus on, my God, I have to survive. I have to get food for my children, and that frees them up from the horrors of, oh my God, we are so poor, and why are they so rich? Why can't I be so rich? Totally. And that is for me, another feature that a complex city has that is really quite interesting and rarely mentioned. You have quite a few cities, say in Latin America. I grew up in Latin America, where you have a brutality of poverty versus wealth that is absolutely obscene. I do find the Americas among the more extreme versions of the urban, and the kind of brutality and indifference towards the poor and those who suffer. I would say the Americas are not the most attractive when it comes to what is a great city. There, I think the Europeans do better, the Japanese do better. There is a variety of places in the world that do much better than the Americas. Let us remember that the America started with invasions. Yes, there were original people, but we more or less killed them all. And the ones that were left was not enough. But it's a history of an extreme brutality. And also, number two, something that is never mentioned, number two, which for me is very important, is the fact that the continent, the Americas, is enormous. The population, except for a few specific cities, the population never was an overwhelming factor.
Yeah, John, you want to comment?
Well,
We already talked about.
yes. About, although Saskia didn't use the verbal noun, about the democratizing effects of cities. There is certainly many grains of truth in what she has to say, that cities, small, middle-sized, and large, tend to be enabling of people. But that proposition, that observation, has to be handled very carefully. It's true in matters when, in situations when there is regulation of cities. Let's take the example of public transport. I have written with a colleague most recently a book on India, and we have in our treatment of the fate of democracy in India, unusually we have a section on transport. And what we try to say in the book is that India's public transport networks are on the whole disgraceful. And this has, in cities, in Indian cities, has powerful destructive effects on people's lives. So there is no natural harmony. It depends upon the mode of regulation of a city. When there is good functioning public transport, I think Saskia was alluding to, say, Copenhagen or perhaps Berlin, perhaps London, Barcelona. Public transport is an astonishing innovation because it enables everybody in the city, if it is affordable, to enjoy the right of motion as equal citizens. You know, that when one boards a tram or a bus or a metro and pays a standard price, rich and poor and everybody in between, black and white, yellow and brown, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, non-believer, and so on, enjoy the entitlement to move through space in time as equals. And cities that do not have decent public transport systems are perforce much more miserable places. So, and one other thing, I think Saskia's remarks about Latin America and the brutality and indifference of cities, yes. I mean, Argentina is considered a democracy. 40% of its population lives in the equivalent of shantytown settings. This is, cities like Buenos Aires cannot be considered great cities if the measure is that all residents of a city, all inhabitants and those who move in and out enjoy equal capacities to live well and to live, you know, in environmentally sustainable conditions. So I think there is no natural law towards the survival of cities that promote well-being. This is a matter for citizens themselves to co-determine. It's a matter of the governments and businesses and other non-governmental organizations and whether they are prepared to nurture that city and to nurture it well. Perhaps, if I may, just one other comment. I mean, one of the complications in these years of the 21st century about talking about democracy in cities and well-being and happiness and so on is that the new despotisms are building cities that architecturally are astonishing, in which there is good public transport, they are clean, there is an effort to purify the air. Cities like Dubai and its tree-shaped Palm Jumeirah island, or visit South China's Nanhui. It's a German-designed new city built by reclaiming land from the sea with a beautiful forest and the beach. Or go to Doha, to the Lusail complex, which is built for the World Cup next year. Go to Kazakhstan and to the new capital city, Nur Sultan. And you will find amazing architecture. You will find well-functioning public transport, but you will also find that self-government of citizens is a phantom. That is to say, these are cities without democracy. These are cities that are governed despotically, with, of course, support of the people of those cities, but where elections don't function as free and fair, in which accountability mechanisms are in short supply. There is, in short, these cities are kind of phantom democracies. And that, I think, complicates the discussion about cities' happiness, well-being, and self-government.
It's a great point. I can also give you an example. Dubai in 2019, they invited a couple of players, us included, to make a urban planning participatory program. They put $100 million in it. Very fancy, but of course everyone knew it was just a facade of participation. But as at the same time, everyone knows that if you don't start somewhere, you can never start anywhere. So what changes for us? The political regime, the participation, the education, the cities. And I wanted to ask you in that regard about this imported democracy that you talked about also in your writings, especially in South American case that Saskia talked, like some people in the early stages of democracy in South America, as you wrote, you're saying we cannot import democracy. It has to grow from within in our own cities, or how do you see that probably as a laboratory? I mean, could one extract something out of that, saying, could cities in a way, in this regard, South America cities are not been rising in sync with democracy, so they are trying to get it in or labor it in slowly? How do you see this?
Well, I'm no Latin Americanist, and you'll have to forgive me for my ignorance. I do think that the more generic question, Pedro, is, do citizens and regulators and other organizations within cities, do they share experiences? Do they network? Well, Saskia has written a great deal about that. As you have pointed out, she is the inventor of the phrase global city. I am interested in more Asia-Pacific examples, because that's the region in which I live, and I'm particularly interested in the impact of China on the wider region. There are networked initiatives such as CityNet. It's a network of cities, of local governments in the Asia Pacific region, and the point is to share information, practices about how to improve the quality of life in cities, whether that be water recycling, or techniques of restricting automobile traffic so that they do not choke cities, or participatory budgeting, or even Seoul, South Korean innovations. It's one of the most dynamic cities in the region in which I live. If you go to Seoul, there is outside the municipal hall of the city government a large red and white big ear, and you can, as a citizen, dictate a message into that big ear, which goes straight into the government, the local government bureaucracy. Or one other example from Seoul, which I learned from fieldwork there, bridge doctors. So how's this for an idea? That university engineering departments charter their students, and they get credit for this, to form teams to go out to inspect the safety of bridges. And in Seoul, I forgot the number of bridges, but it's many tens of thousands. Doing that for the safety of all citizens of that city. This is a simple innovation, but it's the kind of innovation that is shared. Knowledge of that is shared among cities. And they help keep the spirit of democracy alive. If democracy means equality or equalization of life chances, if it means free and fair elections as well, and if it means the public scrutiny of arbitrary power, then it's innovations like the big ear in Seoul, or bridge doctors, that keep alive its spirit and keep up this tradition, this sediment of time for which cities are justly famous.
Great answer, John. Let's move forward and with Saskia's contribution on the next topic, which is potentification of cities. Is it improving? but we having more densified cities with all the problems that are attached to us, all positive sides. But how is it the decision-making process attached to it? Are we going into more extremism, or more loneliness behaviors, or the opposite? Let's listen to what we discussed.
Land being grabbed for so many different functions that the question of space becomes extremely important as well. And so the need to protect the urban condition. For instance, we are beginning to see in certain cities that the government of those cities doesn't want further expansion. They want no more, we can't keep on expanding, then you have these trips to work. For some of the workers, low-income workers that live at the edges of these cities, they travel for 2 or 3 hours every morning to get to their job. And that you see in Brazil, for instance. The Americas has a lot of that sort of an extreme. You don't see that in Europe, but you do see it in the Americas, and you do see it also in China, and you see it in a bunch of other, where really the rich have it okay, but the workers, 2-3 hours of travel every morning, to get, that kind of brutality that is, to me, so extreme. And that is something that I always bring up, but it seems to be a subject that most people don't talk about. But I think that is so important,
It is. Yeah.
And people who are the privileged, who live in our beautiful city in the middle, it's so easy for us to forget that there are workers who every morning get up, at 4 a.m. That kind of stuff, So that then leads me to say, we need, and people always stare at me like saying, what are you talking about? I just say, we have to build new cities. We need to build more cities. You can imagine that they look, there are 2 categories. One is a category of a smart person who says, you know what, I think we're fine with cities. People die. Remember, Saskia, people die so that they then fill in the new generation, etc. And then there are the others who, who really, where there is a vast expansion, like in the Americas, Sao Paulo, these cities that are impossible. And so my students always are horrified and surprised, but surprised for the horror of it, with the notion that these workers have to travel hours to their jobs. But that is the Americas. The Americas are. I think we need densification. It can be at its best. It's a very, very positive format. You don't waste a lot of time. You have concentrated diversities of knowledge and needs and intelligences. All of that stuff. It's all positive. That is what makes a city live. That is what makes a city really be, significant. We need a city. We need our city, etc., etc. So all of that. I cannot imagine it disappearing because we need it too badly. Now, some cities, as you know, have tried to generate very sort of separate, hyper, whatever conditions. That has not worked very well, I think, but for some very rich older people, it makes them feel very secure. There are many, many different modalities in play, but I think when the chips are down, we keep returning to a certain type of mode. It may be enhanced by new, electronic gear, by whatever, but it is a kind of there is an element of something that a set, one way of putting it is a set, a mix of conditionalities that need to be in play in order to have a functioning city, a city that functions for everybody. And that is what I'm trying to get at. So there are many cities now that function for everybody, for the rich, for the poor, etc. There are also many cities that are expanding so much endlessly, and you see that in certain parts of the world, that is a negative.
John, your comments, please.
it's a very unfair dialogue we have going here, because I can say anything I like to Saskia without her being able to reply. It's mansplaining at its worst.
Oh, no, don't go there.
I agree very much that that if the norm is cities that function for everybody, then we are talking about democratic cities in the exact sense that democracy has always stood for a vision that no tyrant, no monarch, no despot, no autocrat is entitled, no theocrat is entitled to rule over others because they're not good enough. And that flesh and blood people are capable, just good enough to govern themselves and live their lives as equals. That we practice that in cities, and the best cities, to repeat, are those where that ethos, that spirit, as Montesquieu put it, is flourishing. That's true for public transport, for instance. I am not sure that in contrast to Saskia, that what we need to do is build more cities. I think their redesign, those that exist, their redesign and their improved self-government, their improved democratic qualities are really what we should be talking about. And here, plenty can be learned, I think, from the history of cities and their contribution as democratic laboratories. Think about the last quarter of the 19th century in Europe and the push for what would be called, for example, in England, municipal socialism. So there ought to be decent sewage so that it doesn't flow and pollute and infect peoples in streets. Or think of the public library movement, the provision of gas and electricity, public parks. I mean, they were all innovations. Some of them are under great pressure as we speak, but they were all innovations designed by their champions to make cities places that function for everybody, as Saskia put it. Question is, what can we think globally of innovations that have similar compounding effects? Well, I can. For instance, there are in several Asian cities, there are social innovation forums, where digital experienced digital analysts, coders come together with citizens, come together with urban planners, come together with elected representatives to think about how a city could become digitally a place in which there is equal access to high-speed, 5G, or it will be 6G networks and so on. Or think about innovations. It's a Dutch innovation, publics. It's a play on the word public. So it's a letterbox, a Julian Assange type letterbox into which citizens can post, and also civil servants can post anonymous messages about corruption, about the need for improved government. Or think about the way that the best functioning cities have been redesigned in the last quarter of a century for people of different abilities. They were, for people with disabilities, they were very unfriendly places. In some cities, there's a greater visibility of disabled people, and there's a greater generosity towards them because of public servicing of their particular needs. common tool workshops where, you know, tools are shared among citizens of a particular part of a city, or festivals. One of my favorite examples is the kiss-in that was developed in Mexico City. So the idea is, on a Sunday afternoon, that citizens are invited to come and to be with others, most of whom they do not know, and to kiss at least one person. You could kiss your partner, you could kiss your lover, you could kiss a passerby. What is the significance of this? Well, it's an expression of affection, bodily affection, a reminder that citizenship is embodied, but it's also, there's a kind of equalization of differences. For the first time, you see someone queer, someone from other LGBTQI groups kissing, and this has, you know, this has a civilizing effect. So there are multiple ways in which are transferable, in which cities can become, as Saskia rightly points out, places that function for everybody, and not just for the powerful, and not just for the rich.
Yes, of course, there is a worrisome component, which is we are seeing, for example, more single house units being on demand on cities, which is, there is more single people than ever. If, for example, in Finland, the latest stats. I want to just to note about the building more cities. When Saskia said that, we also discussed further. I think she was also meaning the fact that it's a bit of a counter movement to what happened before, for example, Amsterdam and Amsterdam Sloterdijk, like the integration of two neighborhoods. Maybe they should be two cities, not just one Amsterdam. Maybe they should. And as the kissing thing that you said follows up also what Montgomery's work has been about, the happy city in New York, experiments with empathy. I need to rush a little bit. I just want to make the last point of Saskia. So we still have your comments on that and possibly one or two questions. Just the last point is, do we still have a voice in the cities, or are we just like bacteria in our intestines, unaware of the organism that we are roaming around? Let's see what Saskia talked about.
That is a good question. I hadn't thought about that, but that is good. That is good. I mean,
maybe it's just an illusion that we think we have a say about the cities, but they've always been there, as you say.
Yeah.
We don't have anything to say about.
But also the notion that the city, inevitably with the complexity, the mix of different types of institutions, different materials for building, also the diversity of climates that the city can have, etc., that they have become very complex little animals. Huh? And now that we realize how much knowledge is involved, we discover how little of that knowledge we, the typical citizen, has, no matter how caring they are. So we are learning something from the plants, you know?
Exactly.
The plants have made visible, and for instance, the fact that in some neighborhoods, very fancy neighborhoods, the people who were trying to make it all beautiful wanted to plant certain plants. Well, then an expert came by and said, no, you do not want those plants here, because it's not going to work for you. You won't like the smells that they will produce by the time they're 3 years old, you know, whatever. And so there was suddenly a recognition that we see a visual when we see a plant. We do not see the infrastructure that it entails, you know, what are the practical, et cetera, et cetera. So that to me also was, this is something that I just learned about maybe a year ago. You know, I hadn't thought that one might put the wrong trees in a city, and that produces negatives. Now, we have all heard from cities, especially in Latin America, that city really has bad smells. Well, it might have been one of those cities that one shouldn't have put there, you know, but we did not know even at that time that the complexity of the trees, that is the interesting part, is that the trees have certain levels of complexity. And we are very familiar with some and not with others. Well, I mean, the city is a very open system. When we say the city, it's an open system.
Yeah.
And because it's an open system, it survives, number one. And because it is an open system, we can be actors, little participations, but we can be actors. We have voice. Whereas there are multiple other things, like the development of canons and whatever, we cannot. So the city is a citizen's site. It also contains secrets, powerful things that have to be hidden, all of that too. But it also is a citizen's place. And so I think we do not want to forget that.
That's very good.
And that is why all these private arrangements for housing, etc. Okay, I can understand that if you live in a very dangerous zone, but let us not mix that up with city. Those are not cities. Those are private arrangements, etc. And so to keep hanging on to the full meaning of the city, a meaning that has changed across time, but a meaning that nonetheless is constitutive of an A, B, C, D that we cannot forget. That kind of, we have to take it seriously. And so every time there is a little mistake that somebody does in some city, like the wrong plant is planted, and all of that, we need to pay attention. Well,
that's it. John, again, can you mansplain it?
Well, I'll try not to, but yes, very interesting remarks by Saskia about the importance, the reminder that the norm is that cities should strive to become what their names imply. In various European languages, the word city is, of course, connected to Latin terms, civilitas, civility, cives, the citizen of a town, civitas is a citizen. So cities were historically, these were struggles, stood for this norm of being a citizen, therefore being an equal who is duty-bound to respect the equality of others. This is still a fine norm. But I would say, Pedro, that the greening of cities that is going on in the most advanced examples, the greening of cities is doing something to that very ideal of being a citizen. Because to be a citizen comes to mean, under pressure from this greening of urban life that is in its early stages and has a great deal of opposition to it from coal miners and actually global warming and so on, species destruction, the citizen becomes someone who, yes, is the equal, duty-bound to respect the entitlements of others and who is entitled to live as an equal, but only insofar as the citizen comes to be conjoined with the biomes in which they dwell, that there is a recognition of an equality or the need for a greater equalization of that relationship between humans and non-humans. It's a very important challenge to the historic, originally Greek and Republican notion of a city. Perhaps, if I may, just one other comment. The greening of cities implies overcoming the dualism of city and country. And this is an unfinished process. There are some cities that I know where actually the rewilding the greening of life is more advanced than in the country. This is a great paradox that requires, fresh imagination, fresh thinking. I would also say one very last comment is that I think that there is a need in these years of the 21st century when it comes to cities and democracy and thinking about their interrelationship to reimagine democracy as a never-ending process within a city and in other contexts, in which citizens and their chosen representatives are on the lookout for dangers, that democracy comes to be the carrier not of blindness or illusions of omniscience, but democracy comes to be a carrier of precaution, of precautionary thinking, of precautionary attitudes. That cities must be on guard in the way that they're governed, in the way that power is allocated, in the way that they treat the biomes in which they're situated, because if they don't, they can actually accelerate the destruction of large parts of our planet. So democracy has a punk quality. It has a quality of restraining abuses of power, restraining blindness and illusions of omniscience of urban planners or corporate builders of high-rise buildings, etc. Democracy comes to be an early warning detector system. Cities need this more than ever. This is a new way of thinking about democracy, and I've tried in my own way to develop that fresh understanding of what democracy is. It is, of course, self-government of people and their chosen representatives. It stands for equality. It is against arbitrary power. It is a whole way of life, but it is also a set of mechanisms for blowing whistles on arbitrary, reckless abuses of power. And in this sense, democracy is an early warning detector system that can prevent the destruction or the self-destruction of cities.
John, we have 5 minutes left. I don't know if Valeria, if there is some questions from the live feed. Valeria, still there? Yep.
For having shared with us some very thoughtful contents. I might also have some questions, but I'm not sure if also our public wants to interact or ask perhaps John or even you, Pedro, that you have been pushing John many times, but we are also curious to perhaps hear more about your own research, because with architecture democracy, now we heard more perhaps the perspective that John generously shared with us, but it would be also nice to see what are the topics that you in those 10 years have noticed that need some attention. Or also now we have been discussing topic as, for example, the homelessness, but also the real fact that in our society, the number of people living by themselves is increasing, which is also pretty much controversial when we speak about climate change, sustainability. So we are having very important things here at scale. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to hear from you now that we have been talking more about architecture in a very, if I might say so, if you allow me the terms, in a very social or anthropological perspective. What we have been trying to do is how people are living in those spaces rather than who is making architecture and how. So what are the topics that we should be aware of? What are the topics that we are seeing as more and more socially impactful, and what are the trends that we are seeing, like we were saying, you know, the homelessness, the living by ourselves, perhaps even the aging of our population. But I would like to give it on to us, perhaps.
Yeah, if anyone has a comment there, I don't want to be.
Beside us, which we are in presence. Thank you very much. Here we go. Ah, Valletta, grazie. What a jump. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. My question is more based on, I think very similar to yours. We definitely are seeing more individuals living alone, and that is a choice that they're making, but it really has to do with that idea kind of combined with the idea of more of a vertical city versus a linear city. Do you see an impact on the concept of democracy as to how that city is formed? Is there a benefit to the vertical city because it creates more open space? Is there a disadvantage to that, and how would that compare to more of a linear city?
Thank you.
It's a great question. If I may answer it, and I give it to John. I think there's a balance in we have to not go too high or not too low. Densification is important. It does enable so much in the city, but at the same time, if you stack human beings too much and in a very chaotic manner, or maximizing the profit, the ROI, the return of investment for the stakeholders that put in the capital, then we are in trouble. We need to have a more social plan, in a way, not to be a bit of a communist. Yeah, we need to not only design cities in terms of what they can offer in terms of streets and mobility, and how many people can they accumulate vertically and horizontally, but we also need to have a proper plan. What kind of communities are these people being integrated into? Hopefully existing communities where they adapt into, because building up a community takes forever, and it would be more productive if we would integrate people into existing ones. And then the verticality, of course, it's also just a physical aspect. I mean, if you're putting a skyscraper of 100 floors, it might be difficult to build up a connection between the person on the bottom and the person on the top. And there's a human scale to everything that we need to be identified with in the cities, and the micro and the macro scale. John, you want to add into it?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the question about individuals and also vertical versus linear. I think we need to think more, and certainly much more research needs to be done about the impact of COVID-19 on this individualization that has been mentioned. I would just caution, I'm a bit old-fashioned here again. I think historically about cities, because, you know, one of the great complaints, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, about Paris is that, you know, it's a clump of people who live anonymously. They pass by others, they have no sense of community, and it's as if they lose themselves in a mass of people and buildings and winding streets. It's an old complaint, but it is, I think, an empirical question. It's a question for research as to what degree physical distancing, for instance, in this last 2 years of this pestilence, will irreversibly fragment, render more anonymous life in cities. About the vertical and the linear, I mean, I think I take it that a vertically organized city is not just referring to the height of buildings, but it's also a reference to power structures. And unhappy and unlucky are those cities that suffer verticality. The much happier cities are those that are messier, more complex, in which there is a kind of entanglement of the vertical and the horizontal. And about Pedro, finally, your old communist social planning. I mean, don't be too embarrassed about this. I already mentioned that there was in the history of cities the push to socialize life. And that meant to make cities happier, more greater equality, equal access to libraries and public spaces and to running water and electricity. So this is not a dead principle. The question is, what does it mean for these years of the 21st century? I think from experience, we are all aware that when we visit a city that is well governed and in which there is a sense that this city belongs to more than a few, this is a much more interesting city, and amidst its complexity and dynamism, it is a place that one wants to visit again. Unhappy are those cities where there is squalor, there is clearly the abandonment of social responsibilities, where the cities feel plutocratic, badly governed, and they're just dangerous. These are unhappy cities, and one doesn't want to visit them again.
John, just a short commentary in the role of the city squares in that process, because if you see, like if you go to Shanghai or Wuhan, we share that city in common, you see that a lot of people in the evenings go into the city squares or corners around buildings to make their dances and their communal activities. But we see also a trend of the last 100 years or so that city squares are being privatized or diminished or controlled or surveilled. Can you just comment shortly on that? I don't know, we are past our time, but hopefully just a short one.
Yes, that trend is a decadent trend that will result in the destruction of sociability. It will accelerate, does accelerate the privatization of experience in cities. And those cities become much less interesting, certainly less plural, and certainly less democratic. It's true, complicated, this question of privatization and surveillance, anonymity. It's complicated by digital network media. We're living through an unfinished communications revolution. We're moving into an age of communicative abundance, I call it, so that staying home can mean going places, that even in the most private domains, one is socially connected. I mean, this needs to be built into the understanding of city life. But unlucky are those cities where public spaces are destroyed by privatization. And it's not accidental that there are cities as under Erdogan's Turkey, where an uprising took place against this despotic trend under a government that has multiplied the number of shopping malls 7 times. An uprising took place because of an attempt to privatize, destroy, develop, modernize the public space. Public spaces remain of fundamental importance for democracy and for the vibrancy and the magnetism of cities, I would say.
Totally true. There was also great big trees in that square. Still are there. Okay, we are past our time. Valeria, control us here. Maybe we have
I don't know if somebody else would like to perhaps share some thoughts or ask some question to Pedro and John, or
If John still has 5 minutes.
Yeah, so it's fine. I have 90 minutes before Monday, so I can go on for a while.
which is a good timing today, yeah? Okay.
Oh, sure.
Well, perhaps just a last note, just to perhaps close it up with some hope. What would be, if there would be any example of these happy but chaotic cities that we can look at, just for get some further inspiration or just consideration for how we can take those as an example for our better living wherever we are in our cities?
If I may comment, because we did some work on this with Michael Sorkin some years ago in Helsinki about the destruction of Suvilahti, which is like a no man's land in the middle of Helsinki, and they wanted to capitalize on that area and build office spaces, the city. And it's a city-owned old compound with even Victorian architecture. And we were against it, and it's still a bit of unclear what's going to happen. I guess they're just waiting for people to forget the complaints and then move forward, and then it just be part of the history. But as we wrote together, me and Michael, that city has to be a mix of experimental. It has to provide experimental arenas. It has to be, as Saskia also said, an open system. An open system cannot be open if there is no room to experiment. And Mike also talked about maybe we should have update our zoning laws or regulations, not just residential office, but maybe things in between, things that progress over time and can change, or temporary structures have to be more alive. I think a city in that sense should be more adaptable in terms of experiment and in terms of temporary structures. John.
Yes, here, if we had time, we could speak about Hong Kong, and Hong Kong as an allegory of the city in the 21st century. Two dynamics currently grip this city. It is large and vibrant. People live in very high density settings. It is a city connected to the rest of the world. Its airport is the largest air freight airport in the world that connects China to the rest of the world. It is a city of considerable diversity. It's geographically up and down. There are rich and poor alongside each other. The cost of living is high. It's unaffordable for many people. There are surprises at every turn in the city. The food is very interesting. There is a buzz, a liveliness 24/7. It has all the qualities of a functioning, viable city with a great deal of inner complexity and anonymity plus sociability. But it is also a city that is now under great pressure to conform to a national security law in which public life in the last 6 months has been actually attenuated. Public life has been stamped upon. And it's a less happy city. It's a city from which there are now large numbers of immigrants. It is an allegory of the way that cities have this democratic potential, but they can also be transformed relatively quickly into sites of what I call despotic rule, where their vibrancy, their plurality, their openness can slowly be choked. It is an open question as to the future of Hong Kong, but it stands, I think, as an allegory of these competing trends.
That's great. I think we should wrap it up and leave, let John rest. Valeria, do you agree?
Yes.
Are you with that?
Yes, that was. Thank you very much for wrapping it up so nicely and for the participation of everybody in here. So we will continue today with some other events for our closing day today. We will restart at 3 p.m. here in Venice, and we have book presentations, but also we will nominate the ECC awards for the different categories which have been part of our exhibition Time Space Existence 2021. So we thank you also for joining us, even if virtually. We will be waiting for another occasion to be together again. Thank you.
Mille grazie, Valeria.
Grazie mille, Timo. Thank you very much. Obrigado, Pedro.
Thank you, John.
By the way, is this recorded?